we've seen the good side of globalization. We are now beginning to recognize the downsides. And so we need a new framework to think about these issues. I've always said that we are using 19th century, 20th century glasses to look at 21st century problems. My name is Andrew Sheng. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong. My main job is basically to think through what are the implications of global issues on Asia. Well, I think the biggest impact on globalization on the world, as it were, as you say, lifting people out of poverty, was the globalization of knowledge. Previously, if you were a small emerging market, some people used to call it developing, but developed countries could not develop if it didn't have access to technology, if it didn't have access to trade, if it didn't have access to new capital. The globalization opened all this up. That's why the Chinese call it opening up strategy. You open up to trade, you open up to ideas, you open up to new culture. You suddenly wake up, realizing that the world has changed and you need to adapt to this. So globalization, brings, like everything else, good and bad things. And I think this is where people tend to oversell any concept that, development must be good. There is a good side of development and there's a dark side. And that dark side means that when you open up your windows, flies come in, as Deng Xiaoping used to say. Globalization is now getting pushback because the standard model of development has been provenly totally inadequate in the areas of inequality. Yes, regional income imbalances have narrowed. That's mainly because of India, China, and recently the developing markets like Africa and Latin America. But at the same time, within each society, inequality has increased hugely. And then, there are things like climate change. Climate change is not local now, it's global. We tend to forget, ignoring the science of what created climate change, that if the ice caps melt, the polar caps melt, the waters, ocean levels will rise. That means, the land will be polluted or will be more salty. Fertile lands will be destroyed. There will be food shortages. The heavy weight of the water in the ocean might cause even, earthquakes because of continental shifts. And that results in tsunamis, hurricanes, as we've seen. So, we may enter into a negative phase of climate change. Whereas the last 50 years, we had very little natural disasters, relatively small. Climate warming was actually good for food production. So that's one area. And then there's, of course, the globalization of technology. Globalization of technology is now very good as designed for consumers. We create consumer surplus, but we have job deficits. Who needs most people? Even doctors are not necessary if everything can be punched into a computer, based on sensors of your iPhone, telling your heartbeat, your blood pressure, and all the data that's available, and give you a diagnosis better than the average doctor, put it this way. So a lot of people are going to be thrown out of jobs, and it's the insecurity about job loss that has created populism, which we are now facing as big pushbacks. So the globalization, we've seen the good side of globalization. We are now beginning to recognize the downsides. And so we need a new framework to think about these issues. I've always said that we are using 19th century, 20th century glasses to look at 21st century problems. And we can't do that anymore. The last financial crisis was the last hurrah of the old model. It's the last hurrah because Uh, it, in very simplistic terms, everything's like growth is like a takeoff of a plane, forgetting to mention that planes stall, and sometimes crash. Nothing is linear. We are moving from complicated societies to complex societies where everything from globalization is interactive, interconnected, and interdependent. And standard economic theory, which assumes away all the things that are important, it made man a machine. The system was mechanical. The projections are linear. Is wrong. So the result of which is that when we entered into this technology age, we suddenly said, well, growth has slowed. Of course it's slowed. If you've got good technology that's energy saving, you don't need to pump out so much oil. You don't need to use so much steel. You don't need to use so much coal. And GDP is very good at measuring the old growth. So when technology, completely disrupts that, they say, well, we can't measure the productivity. I mean, every one of us who's got some common sense would realize that, your individual productivity has hugely increased. How come it's not being measured? Well, the simple answer is GDP statistics as currently measured, to put a very gender not correct statement, is that if I marry my housekeeper, GDP goes down. I mean, that's sheer nonsense, right? We're not measuring what is actually creating, making our lives more meaningful, making our lives more healthy. We're not measuring the externalities, so everybody feels bad. And the old strategy, of course, was also because you're treated as a machine. The whole idea of labor was we don't need these old machines. Let's get them out of the system, forgetting that we're human beings. You cannot treat a human being as a machine. A human being has emotion. That's why we're moving into behavioral economics. Human beings are, rational or irrational. That's wrong because even the word rational is biased. Does rational means you're good? Is a gambler irrational? Why are there so many people speculating? So we're using very wrong concepts, or to put it kindly, incomplete concepts to explain a much more complex, much more nuanced human being in a new world, as it were, the new world of technology, a new world of climate change, a new world of social inequality that we have to address. And because the old model ignored all these issues, there's a big pushback, and that pushback has come through populism. So, and why didn't the polls see this? For a very simple reason. If what I say is politically incorrect, I will not admit it to you publicly, but I will vote in the polls because that's secret. And the reaction is that the not just the extreme right, but the extreme left has also come out of this. So I think economics is changing. It has to change. That's the mission of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and that's why I'm part of this whole group. And we realize that the old cannot continue. The old is not sustainable. What is the new framework is the big debate. The whole emerging markets. That means what we've now seen is that the emerging markets are pushing the world into a multipolar order from a previously unipolar order. The rich countries can sustain big shocks because they are rich, they're very advanced, they've got lots of savings, they've got very sophisticated systems. But look at what happened with three hurricanes recently, right? Harvey, Irma and Maria. Okay, the three of them cost $380 billion. Yeah, something like about 300 plus billion. You know, what happened in Texas and what happened in Florida, very quick response. What happened to Puerto Rico, not to mention Dominica and Cuba and all this, they're devastated. And so for rich countries, you can afford to deal with climate change losses. For poor countries, if you get setback, it's not going to be easy to recover, because who is going to feel generous to donate to get back 95% of the housing that you lose? And so the issue is this. Number one, the lesson I draw from this is, number one, we are now seeing two category 5 hurricanes, which was not supposed to happen before. We are seeing more black swans. That's one point. But the impact on rich countries are not that big. But for the emerging markets, it's the difference between life and death, right? And so if you get very bad climate change as the climate warms up, and water-stressed countries don't have enough water because there's too much heat, and therefore it's not food security goes down, human beings cannot live, cannot get jobs, already have very incompetent governments or strained governments who cannot deal with this. You move from a fragile state, failing state, to failed state. And that causes human migration. And where do they migrate to? The cooler climates of the advanced countries, which are aging, less population, more land, and it's going to create conflict. So the emerging markets are now in, it's not just what we used to call a middle income trap, of a low income trap. We now have a high income trap. The high income countries also don't know what to do. How do you deal with this? The old models need to recognize that humanitarianism may be fiscally unsustainable. You cannot carry on doing charity. It has to be long-term sustainable. You must have a business model, a fiscal model that will be able to help the poor countries, the failing countries, the one hurt by inequality, by technology, by climate change, to get back up on their feet. And we all know in the new network economy, it's not just winner take all or winner take most. So the advanced countries with the superior technology will do well out of the knowledge economy. Those who don't have access to the technology are going to fall back even further. And if they fall back further, a divide creates a search for the divine. God may be the solution. Fundamentalism is the solution. And then from religion, if we're not careful, we really create violent clashes, which was the lesson of history. So we are now in a very critical period of complexity, where if you're a physicist using multidisciplinary thinking, is that there is emergence of a new order, but in between it's going to be chaotic.